It is time for me to share with you chapter 11, which I call the relocation. As was the case concerning the occurrences of last chapter, I must admit that I have no personal recollection of these events. Even after a great deal of reflection and soul searching, I could remember nothing of this part of my story. In a series of long discussions with Kate, I was able to piece it together. So much of the narrative comes from her. In the week following our visit to Burl and Mona, the Department of Child and Family Services notified us that they were prepared to undertake a voluntary placement of Chad. Kate shared the information with me, but the message sat in suspension for more than a week. We did not discuss it. A week later, Kate told me that she was taking Chad to Burl and Mona's. Through decades of her own reflections, as she was able to describe it now, she had felt that she and Chad were in a huge black abyss. She came to feel that the longer she cared for him, the deeper and deeper the two of them would descend into that dark chasm. Something had to be done. Mona also shared with me her perspective of that time and reminded me that Kate could not have continued teaching had she cared for Chad. We simply did not have the help we so desperately needed and continue our lives in some functional way. Rationally, with Kate teaching, Chad was obviously going to need more and more care. The impossibility of us finding help also made sense for Chad's move to be with Mona and Burl. But all of our rational observations merely masked that our situation was not working. Kate could have stayed home with Chad. We did not consider that. Having a rationale for our decision is not the same as knowing in our deepest core that our lives then had come to an impossible impasse. And the emotional challenges of Chad weighed more heavily upon us than did the physical inconveniences. Much of my introspection about that time pivoted upon this crucial and damning question. What the hell was I doing and thinking at that time? What was it that caused me to act the way I did? There we were with a profoundly damaged, dependent, and fragile child. Yet we were unable to talk about it. Months before, I had distanced myself and was not supportive of Kate. She bore the entire burden of daily care, and even more, the solemn and isolated emotional millstone of it. Weeks spent pondering, writing this chapter, have been agonizingly cathartic for me. When I recently shared my feelings with Kate, I apologetically asked her to fill me in on these events. In her kindness and through many years of her own personal evolvement, she had a healthy perspective about each of our roles at that time, roles which I at times had not fully embraced. She knew then, she shared with me, that she had known she must decide alone. She was aware even then that I was truly incapable of doing so. Years ago, I would have denied that observation. Rationally, I was certain that I had been prepared to talk it through and come up with a reasoned and shared plan. That had been my way. And I resented Kate for many years for having deprived me of the opportunity to weigh in with my input. But she knew, as I have come to, that I was standing at a precipice. I desperately wanted to go straight ahead, but the paths only went sharply left or sharply right. Deep in my heart, I knew that it would only become more and more painful watching Chad languish permanently as an infant. Emotionally, I could not take up the ongoing care of him. And yet at the same time, I was manifestly unable to envision him being cared for by anyone else. I felt that he would most certainly be neglected by anyone else, and the thought of him dying without us nearby because I had failed him swept over me like a giant, guilt-ridden wave. There was no palatable alternative. I gave myself an out, an excuse for being out of the loop. Because Kate and I had not had any in-depth discussions for many months, the disjuncture gave me ample rationalization for my own escape from responsibility. I was far safer clinging to that external dysfunction as the fault of our silent deadlock than I was in facing my own irreconcilable dichotomy. Kate knew what I did not, that I was incapable of coming up with an answer. She knew she must make this decision on her own. Although I have no recollection of this evening either, Kate shared with me that on Thursday of the following week, she took Chad to say goodbye to my local family. First, she went to visit my sister and her husband and young family, where our sadness and sense of challenge for us at birth had been a supreme challenge as it had been for her. My sister had had twins 2 years before Chad was born. They were months premature, both of them precariously small, weighing barely 3 pounds and with inadequate lung capacity. Before they turned around and began to thrive, one of the boys had withered to barely more than 2 pounds. Now, 4 years later, they were robust, playful kids. While they had struggled and passed through their dark days, we had not. Kate then went to visit my aunt, and she too expressed the sadness of the visit. She had been unable to have children with her husband, and since his untimely death in a small airplane, she had suffered uterine cancer. She would never have children. She had always wanted them, and our challenges with Chad were incomprehensible to her. But it was her visit with my parents that was most profoundly impactful. Mom had cared for Chad often in the year and a half since he was born, and Mom was a fixer, someone who had always made everything she touched better. She was the little red hen who would do it herself, and the little choo-choo that could. But she could not, in Chad's case, help him become a healthy, normal child. Her sense of failure to fix Chad had weighed her down nearly as much as it had us. Mom expressed incredulity to Kate as she announced that she was taking Chad to live with a foster couple 75 miles away. At first, Mom shook her head in disbelief as she questioned Kate. Then she took Chad from the kitchen into the living room to be alone with him. As she cradled him in her arms and rocked him back and forth, she wept profusely, moaning as she did. Dad and Kate helplessly stood in the kitchen, listening to Mom as they did. Dad could not understand Mom's reaction and repeatedly asked Kate for some insight. Why is she acting this way? I do not understand. I have never seen her act like this. The questions were rhetorical. There was no answer. Finally, Mom returned to Kate, still shaking her head and expressing incomprehension that Chad could be, anywhere but with us. It was a wrenching moment for Kate as well, feeling both the awful sense Mom had of losing Chad and her implicit disappointment of Kate and me as his parents. On the next day after school, Kate prepared to take Chad to his new home. Recently, I apologized to Kate. One of the most significant failings of my life, as I saw it, was leaving Kate to deliver Chad alone and without any support. But you had an important Boy Scout meeting that night and work scheduled for the next morning. I knew you could not go. Kate, whatever I had to do that weekend was not sufficient excuse for letting you take that trip alone. I knew then that you could not do it. I understood then how impossible it would have been for you to let Chad be with anyone else. I knew I had to do it alone. Nothing she shared recently could possibly fully remove the added sense of loss I have for failing to support her then. What had I done that day to help? Did I help her load the car? Did I even say goodbye to Chad? I honestly do not remember. A part of me is still uneasy to seek the answers to those telling questions. And yet, as I will share, the inadequacies I had then have continued to be challenged again and again throughout this lifetime. Kate bundled Chad up and loaded up the car with his things, medications, and the little chair I had built for him in my wood shop. As she described it to me, the trip seemed long and tormenting as she neared her destination. The winding little rural road to Burl and Mona was rough and full of jarring potholes. The road was as agonizingly painful as her own inner journey. But when she drove out after dropping Chad off, the road felt smooth and light. So that's chapter 11. Thanks so much for watching and for all your support. As always, I hope that my sharing is helpful to those of you who have gone through life's experience as much as I have. Thanks again for watching.